Thank you, Clarice. What I've come to learn is that we have a big problem as the continent of Africa, but it is not just us, it's just that it is magnified when we speak of Africa and the problems that we have in Africa. In that quite a few countries in the continent still continue to say that they have a free and democratic nation, but in practice, it seems that it is far removed from being fair and democratic. Why I say this is because two of the strongest parties that might be in the opposition in Tanzania have been strategically removed for whatever reasons that were presented. But that means that the ruling party does not then get an opportunity to actually see if the people on the ground, the masses on the ground, actually support their ideas and ideologies in their numbers. So it is quite worrying. And I do not think that it is something that we want replicated the continent over. But I think that it is a lesson, even before the election has actually taken place. But I think that there is possibilities that we might find ourselves in a position in which we are going to learn huge lessons. One of the things that is a bit frustrating is that whenever you have opposition parties that are as or close to as big as the actual leading party, then you have instability and conflict that might arise. But this is just me saying that we need to be very careful about what we have to anticipate, how it might look like, and what might happen afterwards. I hope that it did speak to your question, Clarice. Thank you. Thank you, Clarice. Within that context, I think democracy, which I don't think we've actually seen a fully fledged democracy until this day, whether from the continent or whether from the West itself, who preach democracy. But the idea of democracy is one where everyone has a voice and the majority in that context are able to elect someone that they agree with. And thus, that means that everyone has a voice in repetition. So, what the logic is, it's primarily to make sure that you find yourself in a position where those who want to contest for positions are able to stand for them without anyone trying to stop them or without anything happening to them, as we've seen with a number of countries that we've worked with overseas, specifically in the East, towards the East, where ideas and ideologies of others do not necessarily agree with the ideas and ideologies that the leaders would like to push, and those people easily get dismissed or they get erased in those specific situations. So, going back to your question, the ideal definition of a democracy is a state in which everyone is free to be able to elect those who they want to elect. So, with using that definition in its most simplistic form, we look at the context of Tanzania and what is happening here. And I believe Prof did speak to it's so unfortunate that reform had to be presented in the same time period as the elections have to happen. Because what happens is that you now have two somewhat slightly different situations, but that require the same people to actually participate in. And now, what that means is that if you want to dismiss people, then you are given the perfect opportunity to say these are people who do not want to reform. We need to always think about that idea of reform, changing things that are the status quo, moving towards a specific target as a union. But when we look at this specific context, that means that if you are able to remove others in the time period where we are looking at reform, and that is a specific period where we have what we regard as a democratic election, then we have a big problem. We have a big problem because when we speak of the idea of a democratic election, a democratic state, we are looking at the ultimate form of freedom for me. But in this specific context, it becomes very difficult for me to make the argument. If anything, it looks very measured. It looks very measured in that the actual parties that you genuinely believe stand a chance to contest the leading party, the main party, the CCM. Those parties are the parties that, for some reason or for one reason or another, are the parties that are being eliminated. That is very problematic. I'm not sure because I do not know the context. I mean, as a person who lives there, I know things in theory from reading about Tanzania, but it is something that I think will make everyone a bit uneasy. I think even Prof would look at this specific situation from the point of view of saying it's difficult to make the argument that this is a coincidence, that these specific reforms are being presented towards a similar date, because ideologically I believe that those in politics do tend to know what others, what their oppositions are thinking, where they stand in specific context in terms of ideology. So now when we take that and then we put it in practice and we look at what is happening in Tanzania, I do make the argument that it might not be in its fullest form a form of a democratic election. And I do believe that the CCM will have a landslide win, especially if nothing happens between now and the elections, because the actual genuine competition that I believe they have is non-existent at this point. And I do believe that it was strategically and systematically annihilated or removed from the coming elections. I hope that I did make sense when I said this, Clarice. Thank you. Yes, that should be the way forward. I think it's the most logical way forward. Why I argue that is because we there's this thing that I always emphasize or I call out, and I call it the Americanization of South African politics. And now in this context, I would call it the Americanization of African politics, where you have where we have our politicians who are arguing against their opposition. Instead of presenting their solutions and suggestions on how to take their different countries forward. And that is where the problem is. Because at the end of the day, if you focus on your manifesto and what you've been wanting to do, then you can actually be able to have a blueprint for the future, not actually be able aiming to destroy fellow Africans and to make them look like they are the problem of the country's reality. That is something that is very key. So I think that that is actually a great way to go forward, and I hope that it will be implemented fully. But also, I will continue to critique the fact that this seems very intentional to try and dismiss those who might dismantle the governing power that has been there since independence. So I think that is something that we cannot just push to the side. In all honesty, I do follow some of the ideas that the current president has, how they believe that the government can move forward, and specifically the country, and the position that she has taken. But I also do need to emphasize that if you have great ideas, the people will vote for you. You do not need to find yourself in a position in which the people who are against you have to be dismissed in a strategic way. That I think is very important and it is very key, because when you are a great leader, you do not need to panic and rethink or think about what is going to happen to me moving forward. Are my opposition going to contest everything and anything that I do or say? So that is very key. But I do emphasize the fact that from an observational point of view, I do like some of these ideas, and I do support the idea of pushing a manifesto, of pushing a specific manifesto and ideas instead of pushing against those who oppose you and your ideas. Thank you, Clarice.
I will stay with you, Paseka Pharumele. Let's try to
Yes.
see how do you think, because now arrest and charge for treason has actually attracted some sort of criticisms across Tanzania, and it has been largely interpreted as a way for the ruling party to sideline the main opposition challenger. So now I quite remember this was during the presidency of Jakaya Kikwete, and according to some sources, he used a lot of diplomacy with the opposition in the country, or some sort of subtle diplomacy. Let's try to understand with you some of those ways or parameters which you think that President Samir or any other politician who holds a button of command in the country can maneuver to ensure that there are no, misinterpretations towards decisions pertaining the opposition candidates. Because now we know treason is actually something that seems very heavy as per the definitions of the states.
It is going to be very difficult, Clarice. It is borderline impossible because that means that we'd have to be very ignorant if we are going to say that there is no coalition between or correspondence between the upcoming elections and Tundu being charged with treason. We would be very ignorant if we say that these two things do not have a rapport with one another. They do not have any relationship. So I think that before the election, I don't know what other possibilities, but I believe Prof did point out that it is less likely for this to happen. But I think, in all honesty, for us to have a situation in which people are going to say this is a free and fair election, we will need to find ourselves in a position where the current president is able to say, I will nullify and I will dismiss the current charges against these particular people. Because it is very difficult to say that it's a coincidence that the two major oppositions or the closest oppositions are the most problematic ones, which whereby one has to be charged with treason and etc. So it is very difficult for me to make the argument that we can say that there is fairness in this kind of situation. And that is why I emphasize the fact that I've seen the current leader in action and I am very happy with a lot of things that she has done. But I do need to emphasize a lot of the time that when you dismiss your biggest opposition, people who actually stand a chance of contesting you in the election, then that means that the election itself is not free and fair. And these specific ideas of what we regard as democracy, and I think the colleague in the studio did emphasize that what we regard as democracy is not what the Greeks themselves initially conceptualized, but in practice, what we do see in this day and age as what we regard as democracy to elect a specific leader, the norms that we are seeing currently in Tanzania are not those that we can say are a part of what we regard as a democratic election. And as I said, I do believe that the current leader has potential to actually succeed without having to rely on tactics that I think I regard as problematic, Clarice. I thank you. I think there's something that we all agree on the panel. The idea that the current leadership or the potential future leadership is leadership that has a lot of potential that might lead Tanzania. And I think it's a very likable leadership that might lead Tanzania somewhere. I think one of the core things that you spoke to is the idea of tourism that Tanzania has. I think a lot of us in South Africa, every time we go to Tanzania, is specifically for those reasons, for us to be able to tour and whatnot. But one of the key things that need to happen is that there needs to be diversity. In a continent with the youngest population in the world, we need to be able to come up with diverse ways in order for us to be able to attract and create capital, in order for us to be able to have these diversified businesses that these youths can partake in. Because one of the problematic things that have happened is that we have a very young population, but that population remains unemployed and it does not work. And if you have a young population that might have great ideas, even in the political sphere, but you are not enabling them to be able to participate, it means that if anything, you are acting against the interests of the country themselves. So I think that there is huge potential for Tanzania. I think there's a huge future, not just in tourism, but in the country itself, being able to self-sustain, to become better and move forward. I think that there's a lot that can happen, but we will need a settled population that aims towards a similar direction, which is less likely. I do understand that it's less likely because it is very difficult to get people to aim at a common idea. We've seen how that has made countries like China, Japan, South Korea, Russia, some European countries like Switzerland, where you have a common idea of what is right and this is the way forward. But because now we find ourselves in a position where we have so many different ideas and ideologies, there is no sense of indoctrination that happens to the masses. We find ourselves in conflicting positions, and because of that, that is why we have these different parties who have different ideas on how to take the country forward. If people buy in into an idea that is very plausible and very probable to lead the country in the right place, specifically socio-economically, then I think that we can have a constantly developing economy, specifically in the context of Tanzania. And I think it is very probable, and it's very likely. So yes, yes, Clarice. I think if we could just follow these ways, and especially with this leadership that I think we all believe is going to, the CCM leadership is going to have a free victory in the coming elections, I think that we can emphasize the fact that if these ideas can get bought into without a lot of conflict, quoting the countries that I spoke to earlier on, then we might see a lot moving forward, specifically for the youth. As I said, I feel like Africa is underusing the power of youth that it has because older generations and older people are still remaining and forcing to stay in power, not just in politics, but in other disciplines. I thank you, Clarice. Thank you, Clarice. I think that that is very key, right, to our current reality. And I think with us as the panelists here, we believe in, to an extent, we do not necessarily have to all be Pan-Africanist, but we do dictate that some of these ideas of Pan-Africanism are things that we align with. And I think when you have leaders who align clearly with Pan-Africanism, then we could actually see a future for the continent of Africa. One of the frustrating things that we've had to deal with as Pan Africanist scholars, decolonial scholars, and things of that nature is these nationalistic leaders that are not willing to align to something that could be seen as a Pan African continent. And I do understand that development is such a difficult thing in the continent because the levels of development are not the same throughout the continent. However, ideas of Pan Africanism are the only solution I think we have as a continent for us to see liberation and for us to move forward. And when you have leaders who genuinely seem to be believing in these ideas, I think you are now moving towards an idea or towards a direction of us seeing the continent liberated. I do understand that a lot of leaders are struggling with this idea of losing power or giving away power. And that is why they'd rather align themselves to ideas and ideologies of nationalism. But that does not liberate the people of that specific country, nor does it liberate the people of this continent. So, in my hope, what I'm hoping to see is not just lip service, not just ideas being shared, but something that is in practice. I know it's a far-fetched dream, but we need to find ourselves in a continent that is visa-less, in a sense that it should be so easy for me as a member of the continent to move from here, go to Cameroon, go to Tanzania, go to Kenya without having to do visas. This does not mean that we have a borderless continent because I've seen that people have started to problematize the ideas and ideologies of a borderless continent. But this means that we would have a free route to be able to move throughout the continent, even if we need to be tracked where we were the last time we were seen, what were we doing at some point. It's not really a problem for me because even Europe in itself still follows those ideas as much as it has made things a lot easier from a socio-economic point of view. I do understand that we are seeing a digression from what it was to what we are currently seeing, where a lot of countries are pushing towards their neighbors leaving their own countries. We see it in Spain, specifically, we see it in the UK, and I think it is the influence of the USA. But I think that Africa still has a lot to do. Thank you, Clarice. Um, I'm not sure how you're going to do that because I think it is human nature to want to be greedy, to want to be selfish, and to want to not release power. So it becomes very difficult for us to say, how do we then persuade those who are in power or those who want to retain power to avoid persuading the population. So that is very important and yet very difficult to answer as a question. I would like to argue that Tanzania, being a relatively free and not so combative country with internal issues, I think that I would like to argue that we just need to sustain the status quo. Prof, I believe, has been emphasizing that this is a country that's on a trajectory. And if you read in the studies, you see the potential that is there for Tanzania, whether we are still here or we are not here, but in the future, for Tanzania to be a very successful country. But there are things that are enabling in an environment. And that is specifically things that we spoke to at the start of this engagement. Or I always use the example of the United States because we would like to make the mistake that these are African problems and only limited to the context of Africa. But we look at what happened in the United States. It doesn't matter how they try to juggle it, how they try to politicize it, and how they try to lie. But the United States was almost in the space of a civil war and a coup. We were on the edge of something like that happening in January 6th. We've seen what just happened in Moldova. This is a European country. This is a country that says that the elections are free, democratic. These are elections that are free and they are standardized. But we know, we can clearly see the signs that there's a lot of interferences that are happening in there. So the reason why I'm pointing out the American example, the North American example specifically, and the South African example, and the European example, is to say that elections are a very complex thing, but you want countries that have successfully and consistently been able to perform them very well and with leadership that seems as though it has a huge backing and support to continue doing the same thing and to support to continue doing the same thing and to continuously support those who are around, that leadership, or those who contest that leadership, not necessarily to contest it, but for the elections to be free and fair at the end of the day. So at the end of the day, Clarice, I think I did not necessarily speak to your question because I think it's a very difficult question because of human nature and how humans function. But I do think that it is essential for us to keep in mind that in order for us to continue what we have, because the continent has had enough bloodshed, the continent has had a lot of problems, and we know a lot of them have been influenced from the outside. We do not need anything like that ever again moving forward. We have so much potential, but because of the greed of men, it becomes very difficult to speak specifically to the issue of control. So yeah, I'll just leave it at that, Clarice. Thank you very much. That is essential. That is essential, Clarice. As I said, relatively peaceful countries that have not really suffered from external manipulation, whether it's European, American from the West, or from within the continent, they need to be supported as much as humanly possible, and that is very important because these are countries that can lead by example. And I think that's why we have had a lot of chatter around the country of Senegal because for many years it was recognized as one of the most peaceful countries with a lot of potential in the continent. But we knew that there was some external manipulation that was happening if the West is recognizing them as such. But countries such as Tanzania, I do believe that these are countries that have the potential to lead the continent. You have leaders who have shown themselves as possible lights of the continent. We are speaking to leaders who will actually follow the ideas, ideologies of Pan-Africanism to its core. And as I always maintain, whenever we are having these discussions and these discourses, that is not going to be easy, but it is something that is doable. It's not easy to do, it is not easy to envision, but it is very doable. It's just a matter of initiative and willingness and wanting for things of that nature to actually be seen, to come true. And I think that is why I always make sure to balance this point of our potential with these ideas of greed that come from nationalism, nationalistic or centering yourself within your nation, not outside, specifically in the continent. I think that is something that is very key that we need to speak to because we have so many leaders in the continent. When the population says they have these pan-Africanist ideas and ideologies that they'd like to follow, these leaders cannot allow them to follow those because it would mean that their power and control would be compromised. I do hope that this is not something that we will see a repeat of in Tanzania. It is essential for us to make sure that the country of Tanzania does not move backwards but move forward, because the more successful countries we have with actual leaders who have potential or who show potential that they can take the country somewhere, the more we are closer to this dream and vision that we have of a Pan-African continent. And I do know that it's far-fetched. It is a distance from now. It is a distance away. But I think with leaders that we are currently seeing on the rise, specifically in cases of the Sahel, we might actually see ourselves moving somewhere that we envision that we should eventually end at. I thank you. I thank you, Clarice, and I thank my panel.
Thank you